Just another couple of things. If you guys would, I was talking with Daniel Lee's father. This is the one who's been ill for a while. He hasn't been coming to church for a couple of months after his coming back out of the hospital. But he's doing better, much better. He's at home, but still not good enough to come back to church and visit with us. He really wants to, but he's not able to. But if you would just keep him in your prayers, I'm going to go visit him this coming week, but I'm sure they would appreciate it. I told his parents that we'd be continuing to keep him in prayer. Let's see. Oh, there's actually, most of you guys probably don't know them very well, but there's a couple that's been coming to our church for 2 years, but the thing is they've only been here a few times in the last year and a half because their older son has been a little bit ill, going back and forth, but they're doing pretty well now. And they had a second child that I met, but none of you met. So we've actually been having a baby boom at our church, if you notice. We have one already that came about early last year, and then we have 3 on the way this year. One almost here. I don't know, but yeah, they sent a birthday cake for Olivia's first birthday. So that was from Rosie and Mike, but they're not here today. But there's a cake, so keep that in mind as well. All right, and yeah, definitely keep all of our families who are expecting an addition in prayer, just for health and for the child and for the mom and for the family as well. One last piece of news. I know a couple weeks ago we did a little cake. It was kind of a belated thing, but Jihoon Jung, who we call Hooney, he's going to come up right now. He got baptized. Come on up. You can come up. He got baptized a couple of weeks ago.
That's right.
So he's going to give the sermon today. No, I'm just kidding. I kind of ordered this kind of late, but we have a gift from our church today. And so we wanted to give it to him today. Just congratulations on his baptism. Yeah, we're just looking forward to great things, and I just want to bless him as well. So I want to give this to you. It's a gift from our church. Father, I want to thank you so much for Hooney and just for his addition to our community. Bless him as he begins this new journey. Help him to grow into the son and into the man that you've called him to be. Bless him in truth and in spirit, and continue to make him a blessing to others. We thank you for him. Bless him in Jesus' name. Amen. This morning, if you'll grab your Bibles, we're going to be looking in the book of John. And we're going to be looking at John chapter 13. I'm actually skipping ahead a little bit, and then I'm going to come back. But I thought this was a very appropriate message for all of us together at the beginning of the year. It's not really a New Year's message per se, but I think it's a great reminder for all of us coming back from retreat. And also, just kind of a really strong foundation for all of us to build this year, to make it a better year, to grow in God's grace. So I want to look at John chapter 13. I'm going to look at the first 5 verses, and then I'm going to look at 2 verses 34 and 35. But I'm not going to read them now, but I'm going to refer to them later on in the message. So John chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. This is the reading of the Word of God. Let me read it out loud to you this morning. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Let us pray. Father, thank you so much once again for a fresh new year, a year where all kinds of things are possible. And Lord, you are the God who created time. And you created it in a way that it flows forward. So the things that are behind are things that we no longer have to live in, but rather we look forward in expectation and faith to what you can and will do, to what you are transforming us into, the masterpieces, the things that you want to build into our lives, the maturity, the blessings, the growth that you want us to have, that we grow from children to adults, that we grow in maturity. And so this morning, once again, as we look at your word, as we look at the life of Jesus and what he did and what he wants us to understand and learn from him, may we grasp your truth. May your Spirit empower us. We love you and give you thanks. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen. So as we begin this new year, I wanted to maybe, if you're a person who highlights or underlines the Bible, I just want to look at two verses as we begin the introduction to this message this morning. And the two phrases that I would ask you to underline if you do that is at the end of verse 1 and at the end of verse 2 in John chapter 13. At the end of verse 1, it says this. The last phrase there is, he loved them to the end. And the last couple of phrases, parts of speech, whatever you want to call it, it says that the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, meaning betray Jesus. That the devil had already put it into Judas's heart to betray Jesus. When you look at those two kind of put together in this passage, it may not be what sticks out to you. I've read this passage many times, and what always used to stick out to me in the past is that Jesus took off his outer garments and he did what a leader normally doesn't do. He did what the father or the person in authority, the person that's highest, didn't normally do, which was take the position of a servant and wash his disciples' feet. But before that, what we often miss is that it says in the passage that John puts this in. He wants us not to miss that. He says, Jesus loved them, his disciples, to the end, to the very end of his life, his time in this world. And then in the very next verse, he says, but Jesus already knew, even as he was loving them to the end, that one of them, Judas Iscariot, was going to betray him. And he also knew that all the disciples were going to run away when he was persecuted. That they were going to all abandon him and forsake him when he was going to the cross. He knew all these things, and yet he chose to love them to the end. And I think one of the reasons that John says that Jesus loved them to the end is because he was one of those that ran away, and he was one of those that experienced God's love to the very end. And you know what? For us, I don't know if you understand this, but I think in this passage, what it's saying is that Jesus had to put forth effort in order to love his disciples at this time. It wasn't always like Jesus was hanging out with his disciples and there was just an effusive love that just kind of poured out from him. Because I know as a parent, I know as a husband, I know as a son, I know that there's times when your family members and the ones that you love and your friends are so lovable because of the things that they do, because of how they interact with you, and you just have such a heart of love. You just look at them and your heart overflows with love. But then on the other side, there's times when you just hate them. I mean, not like forever, but there's times you're like, oh, I just don't want to see their face. I just don't want to be with them. And you need a little bit of time alone. And I think there was times when Jesus felt like, he had to make that commitment. He had to make that effort in order to love them. And at the very end, when everything went wrong and the disciples abandoned him, he probably felt a lot of betrayal. He probably felt a lot of hurt. And yet he committed to love them no matter what. There's a commitment aspect here that we need to understand. And so this year, as we begin it, if there was a lesson that I want us to kind of all grasp, I want us to grasp something very important. Because when Jesus takes off the outer garments and washes his disciples' feet, he's not just doing this action to just show them, you guys are all so selfish, you guys are all so arrogant, you guys never want to love first, you always want to be loved. Yes, all those things, but he says something at the end of John chapter 13 that we have to understand very clearly as Christians. He says in verse 34, and these are the words of Jesus, A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, but just as I have loved you. And he's not only talking about taking off his outer garment and washing their feet, but the 3 years of ministry as Jesus has loved them. And he says, you are also to love one another just like this. Stop being so unloving towards one another. And then verse 35, he says, by this, the way that you love one another, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Do you know what a mark of a disciple is? Do you know what's going to bear out to the world that you're a Christian, that you're a follower of Christ? It isn't how often you go to church. It isn't how much you pray. It isn't how much you serve necessarily. It isn't how much you help the poor. It isn't how much you help feed the people that are hungry. It isn't all your acts of service. It isn't all those things. It isn't how well you keep the law and the commandments of God. All of those things are things that flow out of a love for God and a love for one another. And so Jesus says, what is going to mark you, what people are going to see and then say, wow, he must be a follower of Christ, must be in how we love people. And that's a foundational truth that we have to come back to. And that may sound very abstract in some ways, because I love people. There's not really anybody I hate. I don't have any enemies. But practically speaking, we don't know how to love one another. We don't even know how to love our families sometimes. We don't know how to love our siblings, our parents, especially when they're bugging the heck out of us and irritating us. And Jesus shows in the beginning of this chapter how we ought to love. How the love of Christians is different than the love of people in this world. And trust me, I struggle with this, and it's a reminder for me as well to love like Jesus loved. Because if I truly want to be a disciple, it's not about how much I've read the Bible and memorized it, and how much I study it, how often I go to church, how often I pray. All of those things flow out of a love for God. It's not how much I've served people. It's not how much I've given. It's not how much I've gone out of my way to do things. All of those things are important, but ultimately, if it is without love, it means nothing. And Jesus demonstrates how we ought to love. When you look at this passage, it's interesting because it says that in the very beginning, Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to depart out of this world, to go back to the Father. Saying, my ministry time, my time in this world, in this earthly world is done. It's very close. He knew that it was coming to an end. And it says that he loved them to the end. And what does that mean? It means that Jesus chose to love them even in their unlovable moments. But literally, the end meaning that Jesus is going to stop loving us after he goes out of this world? No. That he loved them to the laying down of his life. To the very end of his life. And literally what it's saying is that Jesus' love is so sacrificial. It's the dying to oneself. The Bible says that the greatest love that you can have, do you know what it is? The greatest love that a human being, that a man or woman can demonstrate, is to lay down their life for another. Doesn't mean you have to shove someone out of a speeding car like in a drama or a movie. Doesn't mean you take a bullet for somebody. I mean, I don't know, you guys are in that kind of circumstances. We don't live in those kinds of neighborhoods. But it does mean that you're willing to die to your needs, your wants, your rights, on a day-by-day basis in your family, in your marriage, at your workplace, with your friends, in order to sacrifice for somebody else. That sounds like you're going to lose out, that you're going to be at the person that's going to be walked all over, taken advantage of. But it is the mark of Christ's love. There's some other things that we're going to talk about that help balance it out. But ultimately, what you have to understand is Jesus Christ's love makes no sense. It's sacrificial. It gives all and gets very little. If anything. When he dies on the cross, he receives nothing. He only receives back later on when we begin to worship and come into a relationship with him. All he gets is us. But he lays down and he gives everything. And there's many who still reject him. And so there's some for whom he gave everything, but people don't receive. And sometimes that's the way your love is going to be. You're going to care for someone. You're going to love someone, even when they don't deserve it, even when they haven't done anything worthy of it, and they may never even appreciate it. But that's how we're called to love. And maybe towards parents who never knew how to be good parents. It may be towards ungrateful children. It may be towards a sibling who never has a kind word. All they have is criticism. It may be towards people at work who take advantage of you at every situation. Maybe people that you know that you'd rather not be around. It doesn't mean that you have to have this bubbly, emotional feeling towards them, but what the Bible says is that we need to love to the end. The way that a Christian love is that it loves to the very end of their life or your life. That's pretty scary. That's pretty crazy. But that's what Christ is demonstrating for us. The second thing that comes out in this passage to me that's amazing is this, that Jesus, knowing that Judas Iscariot is going to betray him, he still gets up from supper. He wraps a towel around, he takes off his outer garment, he wraps a towel around his waist, and he takes a basin of water, and he begins to wash the disciples' feet. He doesn't come to Judas' feet and say, I'm going to skip you because you're going to betray me. He washed his feet just like everybody else's feet, knowing that he was going to betray him. Knowing that this whole thing that he was doing for the disciples, and especially Judas Iscariot, was going to be lost on him. I don't know how you guys are at Christmas time, but sometimes you feel like, I gave the best Christmas gift to this person. Man, I thought it out. And then their reaction is like, thank you. No, but you don't understand. You can do all these things. I remember when we were up at the retreat. It's kind of funny because it's a guy thing, but I'm not going to embarrass him too much. But David had one of those utility pocket knives. And I was talking to Ann. I was like, Ann, pulls it out. And just showing. And it was kind of fun. And I had a couple too. And I was like, yeah. And what women don't understand is how amazing these things are. You can hunt and you can survive, in the winter without anything for at least a few hours, that kind of thing. But sometimes you give a gift and people don't appreciate it. Sometimes you bite your tongue and inside you're like, man, what I had to go through internal turmoil not to have a sharp, sarcastic, mean retort, and you don't even appreciate it. And so you almost want to say, hey, did you notice something? And they're like, no, I don't know, I didn't notice anything. Jesus, in washing the disciples' feet, in another gospel, what we find is this, that Peter says, no, Lord, you're not going to wash my feet. And you know why Peter says, no, Lord, you're not going to wash my feet? For several reasons. Number one, you're the one, you're the master, you're the authority. We're your followers, you're the leader. We should be doing it. But man, all these other Cretans, they're not doing it. I'm higher up, I'm older. Peter's one of the older guys. And they should be doing it. One of the younger guys should be doing it, but they're not doing it. But Jesus, no way you should be doing it. But Peter never thinks, I should be doing it. Well, I can do it. But he says, no, Lord, you're never going to wash my feet. You know why he says that? Number one, partly because he thinks about Jesus, but also because he's saying, my feet are filthy. And what Jesus is doing here is he's humbling himself. And in order to love other people, to sacrifice for them is difficult. But almost every parent learns as soon as they have that first child that it's not as hard to sacrifice for someone you love. It's amazing what happens in your heart. You wonder, oh man, all the work and all the money that's going to be, I've got to change diapers, I've got to do all these things, right? And here's the thing. Most human beings never clean the poop of another human being until they have a child. Think about it. Most human beings, at least, normal people, never wash a person head to toe, another person head to toe, until they have a child. Right? And you would never think to be like, oh yeah, wash my brother, no, wash my sister, no. But for some reason, it's not weird when you do that because that child is helpless. But there's a natural sacrifice that happens. But you know what's harder than sacrifice? It's humbling yourself before another person. See, sacrificing can kind of come naturally. We're willing to. We're willing to give up something. Okay, I'll sacrifice. But humbling yourself is actually way harder. When it's not your job. This always happens within families, Siblings argue, and even within the youth group, I say, hey, who made this mess? Honestly, I've cleaned up behind people too, but for me, and one of the reasons I pointed out for the youth and other people is because I want them to learn how to be responsible for themselves. But oftentimes in families, when you have siblings or 2 or 3 kids, you go, who made this mess? No child ever admits it was me. Because even if they did 90% of it, they know 10% of it was another child. This is why it's great when you only have one child. You don't have to ask them. Don't ask questions that entrap your child, okay? That's illegal parenting thing, okay? If you only have one child and you know that child did it, you don't say, who did this? Because then that child, you're going to set him up for lying. You're going to make your child a liar, and it's part of the your fault. So you say, I know you did this, and so if you clean up, right away, you won't get punished. Basically, don't listen too closely to this, okay? That's what happens. I used to entrap my children all the time, knowing full well I want them to confess. But what I realized is I made them open the door. I made the door open for them to lie to me. Right? Have you ever seen like those YouTube videos where a cute little girl, she's ate the chocolate cake and the chocolate's all over her face, and her mom's just teasing her and said, "Did you eat the chocolate cake?" She goes, "No, I didn't eat no chocolate cake." To humble ourselves means that when we know someone else did wrong, to apologize or to mend the relationship for your part that you did wrong. Because see, you might say, well, that person did everything wrong to me, but you want to restore the relationship, so you're willing to humble yourself and say, hey, you know what, if there's anything in the past or anything over our relationship that's caused this, or, and then usually they realize, okay, you know what, it was my fault, but thank you for extending the olive branch first. It's not to say and take responsibility for something you didn't do, because that would be lying. But it's to say, hey, if I frustrated you, if there's anything that if I misread you, maybe you're having a difficult time, and I just, said things that, I didn't intend to. That's what it means to humble ourselves. Sometimes to do the task that nobody else wants to do. Sometimes to clean up after your brother or your sister. Humble yourself. To take a chore for them when they're in need. The final thing that I want to point out to you, I kind of already touched on it, is not only our love to be sacrificial and humble, but it says after this that Jesus, after he poured the water in the basin, he began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with a towel. Now, that seems like a continuation of the humility, but there's something here that I want to point out to you. Why does Jesus choose washing the feet as his demonstration of how we ought to love one another? Why does he do that? Number one, it's because it's sacrificial and it's humbling for Jesus. But ultimately, you know what it is? It's vulnerable for the person who's getting their feet washed, and it's holistic in the sense for Jesus. What I mean by that is this. You have to let Jesus see the dirty part, the messed up part, the sinful part, the unseeable part, if you will, in order for that love to penetrate. But we can love very superficially. We can love the lovable parts of other people. We can present ourselves as a lovable person and only that part, but we think if they only knew the other parts of me, they wouldn't love me that way. The love of Christ is calling us to love the person holistically, every part. Their past in a redemptive way. Their sins, their failures, their flaws. Yes, we need to help them change and mature and transform and grow, but we're supposed to love them as they are, the person that they are as well. And that means vulnerability. That means knowing their flaws and yet choosing to love them. When Jesus washes their feet, they had been out wandering around with sandals on, with all kinds of stuff in the feet. This past retreat, I didn't even notice it, but I have you guys all know this now, but I have very sweaty feet, and so my feet always get hot. And you guys know, some of you know, but I get athlete's feet very easily. Not because I'm athletic, but because my feet sweat. And so last year I had 6 toenails pulled, right? Because that's how they get rid of it. And, it's kind of painful, but it's all right. But so this winter I've been really good about keeping them clean and trying not to get it again. And so at the retreat, you guys probably noticed I was wearing sandals in that cold weather, and I was really feeling good because my feet weren't getting too cold and they weren't getting too hot. It was perfect. At night I was wearing sandals. I come back from the retreat and I realized my feet were all cracked because they got all dried out. And I realized, if you wear sandals all the time, there's a lot of gunk on them from walking around at the retreat. This is why shoes are good. But I was kind of wearing sandals for 3 days, and oh man, every night I had to wash my feet. But think about the days of Jesus. All the dung, all the horse manure, all the animal stuff, and everything else, and the mud. And so Jesus is a servant's job, but he was doing it. So Peter said, Lord, you can bless me on my head, anoint me with oil, and do all these things to the clean and the kind of, presentable parts of me. But all my feet, oh man, they're smelly, they're dirty. It's the shameful part. I don't want to. And Jesus says, what? Unless I wash your feet, you have nothing to do with me. In other words, I want all of you or none of you. Stop hiding. I love you as you are. I know all things that have ever been done in your life, that you've ever done, that you've ever thought, and yet I accept you. And so as Christians, we're called to love people regardless of what they've done, regardless of their past, regardless of all those things. It doesn't mean that we still love the sin or abide by the sin or allow the sin. We call those things out in truth, but we love that person. We don't love only the lovable parts. We love the person in total. To love as Jesus loved, to demonstrate the love of a disciple, means to love sacrificially. It means to love with genuine humility, lowering yourself, humbling yourself. To love holistically, the whole person, flaws and all. And if we learn this, and we begin to act upon this within our families, among our friends at our workplaces, then the world will know that we are Jesus' disciples. Then the world will want to know who he is. And we will bring